Good evening and welcome to tonight's evening conversation with World Bank President Yong Kim and Ambassador Tony Hall on mercy, justice, and flourishing, faith and holistic poverty alleviation. We're so excited that each of you are here for what promises to be a fascinating and provocative conversation. I know several of you have joined us for past events such as this, and this is actually one event in a 5-part series that the Trinity Forum is sponsoring on the overarching theme of faith and international development, which was sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation along with a new venture fund. We were delighted to kick off this event not long ago with Mike Gerson and Steve Bowman speaking on the subject of who is my neighbor, thinking faithfully about international development. And then just last month, we were able to host Ambassador Mark Lagon and Catherine Marshall. And Mark is here with us this evening on the subject of human dignity. Over the course of the next few months, we'll host an additional 2 evening conversations on that broad topic. And October 16th, we'll get to hear from Jenny Dyer, and then later from World Vision CEO Rich Stearns, along with Opportunity International CEO Peter Greer. We've been really thrilled to bring this series to DC and to sponsor efforts to think deeply about international development, its challenges and its constraints, and what it means for how we should be thinking about foreign aid and what it means to love our neighbors and other countries. And while we're delighted that each and every one of you have joined us this evening, there's a few special guests I'd also like to recognize. One of our Trinity Forum moderators, Dr. Jonathan Quick and his wife Tina, have flown down from Boston to be with us for the evening. They have done a lot to help make this evening possible, and we really are just grateful for your participation and your presence this evening. We're also delighted that Dr. Carrie Hessler-Radelet, former Peace Corps director and the CEO of Project Concern International, who, along with John O'Quick, will be one of the introduction and forward authors to our upcoming reading, is also here tonight, along with one of our sponsors from Nashville, Sam Funk, who flew up for the occasion. And I understand there are around a dozen or so pages and proctors from the U.S. Senate Page program with us here this evening as well. So we're delighted that you're here. If this is your first time or you are new to the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do that in part by hosting evenings such as the program tonight to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging those big questions of life, and ultimately in coming to better know the author of the answers. And certainly, one of the great questions of life concerns how to do justice, show mercy, and enhance the flourishing of those who suffer and are in need. Or, to put it another way, how we come to understand the biblical injunction to care for the least, last, and lost, to recognize our obligations and our ties to those who are struggling, and to lean into the command to love one's neighbor as oneself, and all of the attendant care, persistence, initiative, creativity, and shrewdness that implies. Our speakers tonight will tackle the weighty question of whether and how holistic poverty alleviation for those who suffer the most is possible, what that means, what it would take, why we should care, and what we should do. It is an audacious, inspiring, even daunting goal. But there are few who can speak to it with more expertise, broad range of experience and insight, or long-term dedication to the plight of the poor than our speakers tonight, Dr. Yong Kim and Ambassador Tony Hall. Dr. Kim is the 12th president of the World Bank Group. In that role, he's led the World Bank to establish the goals of ending extreme poverty by 2030 and to boost shared prosperity among the 40% of the lowest rung in developing countries. His career has long revolved around health, education, and improving the lives of the poor. Before joining the World Bank Group, Dr. Kim, who is both a physician and an anthropologist, served as the president of Dartmouth College and held professorships at both Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health. From 2003 to 2005, as the director of the World Health Organization's HIV and AIDS department, he led what was called the 3x5 initiative, the first ever global goal for AIDS treatment, which expanded access to antiretroviral medication in developing countries. He previously co-founded Partners in Health, a nonprofit medical organization that works in poor communities, now in over 4 continents. He has received a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, was recognized as one of America's top 25 leaders by U.S. News & World Report, and was named as Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Responding to Dr. Kim will be Ambassador Tony Hall. Tony is widely recognized as a leading advocate for hunger relief programs and improving human rights conditions in the world. He served as ambassador to the United Nations agencies for food and agriculture and is currently serving as the executive director for the Alliance to End Hunger, which engages diverse institutions in working to end hunger both at home and abroad. Prior to his diplomatic service, Ambassador Hall spent almost a generation, almost 25 years, serving as a member of Congress from the 3rd District of Ohio, the longest serving representative in that district's history. During his tenure, he founded and served as chairman of the House Select Committee on Hunger and the Democratic House Task Force on Hunger, founded the Congressional Friends of Human Rights Monitors, as well as the Congressional Hunger Center. He has also, I'm proud to say, been nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. Hopefully 4th time's the charm. At the end of Dr. Kim's remarks, Ambassador Hall will give a brief response, and then both Dr. Kim and Ambassador Hall will join me up on stage for a short moderated conversation, after which we'll turn it over to you for the most dynamic part of the evening, questions from the audience. With that, Dr. Kim, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor and a privilege to be here with you. The reason I'm here, I've heard about the Trinity Forum, but it's really Jono who has been telling me that I need to come here and I need to engage with this fantastic audience. So let me, it's different at this meeting. I can talk about things in a bit of a different way. So I'm going to tell you the story I know best, which is my own story. The history of Christianity in Korea is rather short. It's a little over 100 years. My great-grandfather was one of the first Christians in Korea. And at the age of 19, he decided that he was going to go and study with Reverend An. There was a very famous movie actor with the same name. He played one of the sages on Kung Fu, if you guys, the older ones, you remember this. But he had come to the United States when he was young, learned about Christianity, became converted to Christianity, and then went back and started the very first school. It was in the northern part of Korea to teach Christianity. Now, my family was a family of scholars. They were court scholars. They were Confucian scholars. They wore the top knot, and they served as aides to the king of Korea, talking about Confucian righteousness. Back in those days in Korea, men got married when they were 13 years old. So inside the house of my great-grandfather, when he was 19, there were 5 generations living in the same house. The oldest was his great-great-grandfather, I think that's right. And he was 90 years old. Thankfully, we have longevity in our family, so 5 generations was possible. He was still absolutely lucid. And when my great-grandfather went in to say, I'm not going to go and be a court scholar, I'm going to convert to Christianity, his great-great-grandfather, the 90-year-old, went out into the yard, picked up a large stone, went into the kitchen, and broke the rice bowl, the big pot that they used to make rice. And he said that if my great-great-grandson is going to give up this tradition, how will I face my ancestors? We should not eat anymore, right? So he literally broke the rice pot as a symbol of his unhappiness. Now, the story was told to my mother's brothers and sisters when they were young, and the story was told by the mother of my great-grandfather. And she said, it was the happiest day of my life, because these crazy Confucian rituals, every 2 weeks I had to cook for like 100 people. It made my life so much better. Right? So the history is that recent. Now, in China, Christianity took hold because of missionaries, the great Italian missionary Matteo Ricci. If you've not read The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci, it's one of the great books. But he learned to speak Chinese. And it was the influence, the power that the Chinese felt in Christianity, I understand, that made the conversion. But in Korea, it was an entirely indigenous process. It wasn't missionaries that converted the first Christians. And my mother, who is a theologian, argues that it was really a rejection of Shintoism, that Japan was occupying Korea at the time and was trying to convert everyone to Shintoism. So part of what they were doing was adopting something that they allowed them to reject Shintoism. So our history with Christianity goes way back. My family is full of theologians. My mother when she graduated from high school in the early 1950s, was given one of 2 scholarships that were given to the top 2 Korean students, the top 2 Korean women students. And after going through undergraduate school, she ended up at Union Theological Seminary in New York City in the 1950s. So her teachers were Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, among many others. And she said to me once that, studying theology in New York with Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich was like learning to paint in Paris under Van Gogh. And, these 2 were great influences on Martin Luther King. Many of you may know that. In one of my favorite books of all time, he spoke specifically about Niebuhr's social ethics in his great book, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And when Paul Tillich died, King wrote about Tillich, and I quote, "He helped us to speak of God's action in history in terms which adequately expressed both the faith and the intellect of modern man." Now, I had a kind of crazy childhood because my mother used to talk to me when I was like 13 about the shaking of the foundations, and those of you who know Tillich's theology wrote about that. She gave me books by Reinhold Niebuhr. It was unorthodox growing up as a wannabe jock in Iowa, reading Tillich, Niebuhr, and James Cone. But it influenced me tremendously because I first of all, at first, having all these influences, I started out at University of Iowa and then went to Brown University. And at Brown, I was so taken by the study of philosophy and political science that one day I came home from school. My father picked me up from the airport. We lived in Iowa, so we had to drive about 30 minutes home. And then he said, so Jim, you have to choose a major. What do you think you want to study? And I said, Dad, I'm going to study philosophy and political science, and I want to go and start a political movement. So he slowly pulled the car over to the side of the road. And he looked back at me and said, well, after you finish your residency, you can do whatever you want. So it turns out he was right. I mean, it was great advice, but I had these 2 influences. My mother, who'd studied with Tillich and Niebuhr, and my father, who was a dentist, among the most genetically practical people on earth. And the 2 of them together had a huge impact on me. Now, fast forward, I ended up going and doing both. I did a medical degree and did a PhD in anthropology at the same time. And after doing that, I began to ask a pretty fundamental question. So now what do we do? Now what? I've done all the things that I'm supposed to do, all the hoops I've jumped through. I finished both degrees. And then at that point, the question was, when you have something, and my good friend Paul Farmer used to call it our ridiculously elaborate educations, what do we do? And we began speaking with each other, and we asked ourselves the question, what is the best idea? What is the best moral foundation upon which to take action? And we, as graduate students, we read, up one side Marx and down the other, this notion that we could create equality of outcomes for everybody. And what it took was, agitprop and a vanguard. These ideas were around still. I mean, it was late 80s, early 90s when there really was a discussion between market economies and planned economies that just traded with each other. And there was this sense that we could reach a kind of nirvana of equal outcomes. And so we played with that idea. But we ended up saying, but that doesn't really help much. What is it that we actually do? And so we ended up reading a lot and then interacting a lot with the liberation theologians. And liberation theology, I mean, if you want to understand Pope Francis, read liberation theology, because essentially is how he approaches the world. And when I met Pope Francis, I've done a lot of work in Peru, so I was able to speak to him in Spanish. And I explained that we tried to build an organization and a movement around this notion of a preferential option for the poor. Now, where that came from is in Latin America, the Catholic Church wasn't spending its time with the poor. That the Catholic leaders were often supporting military juntas, supporting only the elite. And this very incredibly thoughtful group of Catholic priests led by people like Gustavo Gutierrez of Peru, the Boff brothers in Brazil, wrote about getting back to the roots of Christianity and asking the question, if Jesus were here today, where would he be? Would he be with the military leaders in the capital, or would he be living and working among the poor? And for them, the answer seemed obvious. And what they then did was to say, it's not just a matter of being with the poor, we have to have a methodology of working with the poor. And so for that, they looked to the great Brazilian educator, I'm blocking his name, Jono knows it, what's his name? Paulo Freire, right? Paulo Freire wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he said that the way that you work with the poor is not to tell them what to do, but to let them discover their own reality and decide for themselves what to do. And he borrowed a lot from John Dewey's notion of education. And so liberation theology's method was see, judge, act. What is the nature of the situation? What does it mean? And what do we do? Now, for a time, the Catholic Church had a lot of trouble with the liberation theologians because some of them really verged on becoming Marxist, and some of them actually did become that. But the core, people like Gustavo Gutierrez said, this is an idea and an approach rooted in our faith. So we began asking the question, so what does that mean for us? And what it meant for us is to go to the poorest communities and to privilege the desires and the actions, the desires and the aspirations of the poorest, and not stop because we thought that something was inappropriate or not cost effective or just it wasn't appropriate technology, which was a very popular term back in the 80s. And the priests that we worked with the so-called base communities, Episcopalian, Catholic mostly, but even evangelical also, communities that were deeply embedded among the poor. And an Episcopalian priest that we worked with, when we asked him, well, what do you think about appropriate technology? He said, appropriate technology just means one thing: good things for rich people and crap for the poor. And so what would that mean for us? It meant starting with what they told us. They were hungry. We built a bakery. They wanted schools. We built schools. They wanted a hospital. They didn't want just vaccines. They didn't say, we're really not that cost effective, so just give us vaccines. They said, we want a hospital and we want to live just like everybody else. So that's what we did in Haiti. Now, this became tested when we started a project in Peru. Because in Peru, we ran into an epidemic of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And that is the most difficult thing practically in the world to treat. It requires 12 to 18 months of therapy. It requires an injectable. You need to give intramuscular injections 6 days a week for about 12 months minimum. It's the most difficult thing to treat, but that's what was in front of us. And so we had a crisis of faith right at that point, because at the time, just the drugs for a full course was about $30,000. And at that time, the religion of the time was cost effectiveness. Oh, you only should do, when you're in poor communities, you should only do what's cost effective. And at the time, there's also very little money for global health. What we decided to do was to say, okay, we're not going to play that game. We came into this work committed to making a preferential option for the poor. So we're going to take on the argument. And Jono was there for a lot of it. I mean, Jono was at the World Health Organization at the time, and frankly helped us so much because we got our drugs on the essential drugs list, which is what Jono was working on. But everyone was against us. The global health elite was against us. The people in Peru were against us. And it wasn't just, what I thought is that people would say, you're nice guys. It's so nice that you want to do this. But I just don't think we're going to be able to do it. That's not the reaction that we got. The reaction we got was rage and anger. They were saying, how dare you suggest that something can be done that we haven't done? You're not critiquing, you're not just saying, let's do more, you're critiquing us. You're telling us that we should have done this. And there was rage. I mean, it was shocking to me. The head of the national TV program in Peru was a great guy, a friend of mine now, said, not only did he not say, thank you for trying, but maybe we won't do it this time, he said, if you treat a single patient, we'll kick you out of the country. Right? So we started this fight, and for us the preferential option for the poor did not allow us to say, well, they're just poor people, so let them continue to have MDR-TB, and we're going to turn our head this time. We're going to turn our head because we just don't have enough money for it. We just started scrounging. We started borrowing medicines from the hospital we worked at in Boston, and and it was only because we had friends in the infirmary. We told them what we were doing, and they kept ordering them for us, and they would charge it to a fantasy number, and they would put it out there. And finally, the president of the hospital found out, and somebody actually paid for the drugs, but we wanted to get them on treatment, and we had great outcomes, 85% cure rate, cure rates that no one had ever seen before. And then finally, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, sponsors of this, gave us $45 million, changed everything. And all of a sudden, we became mainstream, and it's a good thing we did, because the problem is really bad still. And we started too late. We were using the wrong analysis. Preferential option for the poor was not the only analytic framework. Also, the science would tell you that tuberculosis, the only way to stop the spread of tuberculosis is to treat the people who have it. But in this case, there was just so much anxiety about what we were doing, they weren't thinking clearly. Soon after that, AIDS happened. And we thought, oh my God, it's the same thing. Because everyone was saying, well, there's 25 million people living with AIDS in Africa, but it's just not possible to do it. And there is a film about the work that we've done called Bending the Arc. It'll be opening here in DC on the 13th of October. It'll be playing at the West End Theater, actually. And we have video clips there of the administrator of the US Agency for International Development saying, you can't treat HIV in Africa. They don't have watches. All they know is that the sun comes up in the morning, the sun goes down at night. You tell them take a medicine at 10 o'clock, and they'll say, what is that? After he said that, it became very famous. He had just visited Africa slightly before, maybe a few months before that. And the people in Africa hosted him, said, it's a funny thing, because this person, I won't use his name, but this person was the only one who was late to every meeting. But, many of you probably can't remember, but the leading lights of global health, the leading lights of academia, the leading lights of HIV treatment, all were saying, just about everyone, and again, John remembers this, just about every single one of them were saying treatment is not possible. There are 25 million people in Africa living with HIV. I'm sorry, but they're all going to have to die. And there were people who literally said, treatment, I think we're talking about the next generation. And those of us who'd been to Africa were seeing that the fastest growing business in most of these countries was coffin building. Right? It was a situation of absolute terror. And so I was running around saying, it's the same thing. And in fact, HIV treatment is easier than MDR-TB treatment. The person who changed everything. Well, look, the activists are my heroes. They were great. But these were people living with HIV who had a stake in the game. The person who changed everything is President George W. Bush. Right? His act of courage in starting PEPFAR was is going to be remembered as probably the most important thing that happened to Africa in the last 100 years. If he had not started PEPFAR, I don't know where it would be. I have some data in here. I'm not following my talking points very well, guys, but the number of people that were saved by PEPFAR, $30 billion, and 11.5 million men, women, and children are on antiretroviral treatment. And this was the largest treatment program ever. It just broke every mold. We were literally shocked the day that he announced it. We'll never forget it. It was January 28th of 2003. So we won that argument too, but we won that argument because of President Bush. But for us, I remember going into a room with Paul Farmer, and whenever we went into a room to talk about HIV treatment or MDR-TB treatment, we'd have to sit on different ends of the table. Because if we sat together, and we often didn't see each other very much because we were traveling to different places, if we sat together, the people at the other end would start bad-mouthing us and say, these guys are crazy. Are you first MDR-TB treatment, then HIV treatment. What is the matter with these people? So we used to sit on both ends of the table. And one day we were doing that and arguing like crazy on both sides. And we walked out, and Paul looked at me and said, Jim, aren't you glad we have option for the poor? Right? Because it gave us a sense of clarity. It was not about whether or not it was cost effective or not. It was, you start from the perspective of the poorest among us deserve everything that everyone else deserves. Now, I need to stop, I know, so let me just take you, we can talk about some of the other specifics. Let me take you to where we are now with the World Bank Group. So if you heard the first goal, end extreme poverty by 2030, effectively we've brought the preferential option for the poor to the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group had never set a target for the end of poverty. There's something on the wall when you walk in, it says, our dream is a world free of poverty. And I just asked a question, when are we going to stop dreaming about it, and when are we going to put a deadline on it, right? Because when you have an audacious goal with a deadline, you have to start with the end in mind and then go backwards and say, so what would it take to actually get there? We now are very focused on boosting economic growth. That's one of our 3 pillars. Boost sustainable and inclusive economic growth. The second is invest more in people. And the third is to build resilience in countries to things like famine, climate change, pandemics. So these are the 3 main things that we do. Let me just make one more point before I give the floor to Ambassador Hall. When I was in graduate school, we had this sense that maybe planned economies would work. But if you haven't heard it or read it, read President Xi Jinping's speech that he gave in Davos just in January of this year. President Xi Jinping stood up and said, look, I'm the leader of the largest communist party in the world. And I'm telling you that the global system is the ocean we all swim in. Any effort to stop the flow of goods, capital, and ideas and turn that ocean back into lakes and creeks will fail. And so when I work with the Communist parties of Vietnam and China, the one thing they ask me about is how can we insert ourselves better into the global market system? So the debate is over. The Chinese Communist Party has told us, we tried equality of outcomes for a very long time, and it didn't work. And then when they switched to a market-focused approach, and when Deng Xiaoping said things like, to get rich is glorious, everyone forgot the sayings from the literate book of Mao, and everyone remembered what Deng Xiaoping said. In comparing market economics to planned economies, he said, I don't care if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. And they lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. The greatest poverty alleviation program in the history of the world. And so when I got to the World Bank, what I had to learn, I knew development. What I had to learn was macroeconomics and finance. And just a little clue, the macroeconomists actually don't understand finance very well, and the finance folks don't understand. I thought they were all the same tribe, right? But they're not. So I learned about projections, the economic growth projections from the macroeconomists, which were always wrong. And I kept saying to the economists, if as a doctor I was wrong this much, not only would I not be a doctor, I'd be in jail, right? But because they're the only ones who have these numbers, everyone still listens to them, right? They're good people, don't worry. The finance people, though, were the really, really interesting people. They taught me about swaps and different ways of using insurance and bond spreads and foreign direct investment. All these tools that rich people use every single day to make themselves richer. We actually invented the swap. And swap is for the non-financial people, which is very simple. You exchange cash flows, and you can adjust your own risk tolerance and adjust your own portfolio. We've now done credit swaps where we have too much money in Ukraine, and we need to give them more, and we swap with another development bank, and there's just so many different ways that you can use the global market system to make yourself wealthier. And we have been trying off and on to do that with poor people, but we haven't done it enough. And so, I actually said a very cheeky thing to the papal nuncio, the person who represents Pope Francis to both the United Nations and the World Bank. And I said, Xi Jinping said, global market capitalism is the ocean we all swim in. And look, I'm not an ideological guy, but I feel that my moral duty is to use the tools that rich people use to make themselves wealthier every day intensively to serve the poor. And so, Pope Francis's denunciation of the people who work in finance, I think is unfortunate. And I said, and I'll go further. Anyone who says they care about the poor and who ignores or denounces finance is committing a sin. I thought that was really fun, telling the cardinal that the Pope was being sinful. But we now have done things that I never could have imagined. Just this past June, we created pandemic insurance. Rich people insure themselves for anything and everything. Poor people have no insurance. So we found a way to create an insurance product so that in the 78 poorest countries in the world, if a pandemic reaches a certain level, money will automatically disperse. And all we had to do was find out what the likelihood of that happening, and we found a number, 3.7% a year, and then offer to pay interest at a rate high enough for people to take the risk. $450 million we have. It's capital at risk over a 3-year period. They could lose every penny of it, but because they're getting 8.71% on average across the insurance instrument, people were willing to give us money. Now, what's the lesson there? The lesson there is that whenever rich people do things, they share risk with the capital markets. In this case, we are sharing the risk of responding to pandemics with the capital markets. And the reason we're doing it is during the Ebola outbreak, we had to wait until a country became generous, and nobody was being generous. So the World Bank, and we never do this, I had to be the first one. We pledged $400 million. And then afterwards, other governments jumped in. But it was almost to the point that it was going to explode, and we were not going to have any money. So I thought, can't do that. We cannot do that. And so we created this entirely new insurance instrument. Let me leave you with just this thought, and we can talk more about any of these issues later. I have been so enamored with all of the fantastic new things we have in global health and in global development, data, evidence, big data. There's so many great things that we have, but at the core of what we do is still moral foundations. And unfortunately, that conversation is going in many different crazy directions right now. And the moral foundations are not just about my relationship to my God. The moral foundations are, what is the nature of our responsibility to our fellow humans? And the conversation on human solidarity has got to be reinvented with much, much more vigor. And I think it's going to sound something like this. All right, so part of the discussion on human solidarity went down the path of saying everyone's the same and all the outcomes will be the same. That didn't work. So if that didn't work, then what we have to turn around and say we're absolutely committed to is equality of opportunity. And that means much, much more investment in health, education. Ambassador Hall's going to talk about nutrition. There are 155 million kids today who are stunted. India has 38% childhood stunting in its population. There is no way that 38% is going to be able to compete in the digital economy of the future, right? This is a stain on our collective conscience right now. We've got to find a way to increase the pressure on heads of state, ministers of finance, to really tackle these problems. They haven't felt it yet. I'll talk about it more in the question and answer period. As we look back on HIV, some of you in the room were shaking your head saying, well, how could they have said that we're not going to treat people, 25 million people? But let me tell you, if we had a room like this in 2000, 99.99% of the people in the room would have said, are you crazy, HIV treatment? That's impossible. Everyone agreed that it was impossible, right? Bill Gates said, HIV treatment, I think we're talking about the next generation, right? And he's one of the greatest heroes of global health. That's what he actually said in an interview. And so the point is not to look back and shake our heads and cluck our tongues. The point is to look right now and say, are there issues that we're ignoring right now that in 20 to 25 years, they'll look back and shake their heads and laugh and say, are you kidding, really? They really thought that was okay? What are problems that I think rank at that level? I think the epidemic of childhood stunting is right there. I think the epidemic of really poor education. We just put our World Development Report on education out. Educational outcomes are just horrible. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 3/4 of third graders cannot read a single word. So they're in school and learning nothing. This is something that we're going to look back on and say, how could we have done that? Climate change, I think, is one of those issues. That we're going to look back and say, how could we have possibly not been much more aggressive in tackling climate change when, in fact, we could have done it with lots more economic growth if we switched the economy to a low-carbon economy. So these issues exist always, and I would suggest that in a place like the Trinity Forum, the place to start is not necessarily the data. The place to start, I think, is more reflection, to think about the challenge of an idea like a preferential option for the poor, and then to take action accordingly. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Kim. And it's wonderful to be with you, and it's an absolute honor to be part of this Trinity Forum this year. Dr. Kim is an inspirational figure to so many of us, and I'm so very glad and humbled to share a stage with him. I was asked here today to respond to Dr. Kim's remarks and to offer my own perspective on how faith can and should guide our development and aid efforts around the globe. I really think the bottom line of what I think Dr. Kim was telling us is that all the things that the World Bank and what he has done and what the G8 has been doing and AID and so many good programs around the world is that these programs work. That we, and I like to associate myself with it, that we have cut poverty in half. That's his message. We have cut hunger in half. And most people in this country do not know that. That is an amazing message. These programs work. These medicines, microcredit, school feeding, nutritional programs, teaching mothers how to read and write, they work. Can you believe this? We've cut poverty in half. And we need to get that message out. The message is not out there. Now, we know it in this room, and many people, I think, in Washington know it, but I know they don't know it in Ohio. I'm trying to educate, but a lot of people in this country don't know it, and this is a wonderful message. As some of you know, I've spent a significant amount of my career in national politics as a congressman from Ohio for 24 years and U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture for 3.5 years. And what many people don't know is about me is that I actually found my faith after coming to Congress. I had to come to Congress to find the Lord. Let me be clear, I found faith while in Congress. Not faith in Congress itself. I just want to make sure that we clear that up. It wasn't too long after I found my faith in Congress, I was introduced by a friend, and he got so excited, it was a group like this, and he said, I want to introduce Tony Hall. He's a U.S. congressman and a Christian. And people started to laugh, and an older man down front, he just couldn't take it much longer. He started to squirm in his seat, and he just hollered up at me. He said, make up your mind, buddy, you can't be both. As part of my journey, I when I became a person of faith and I fell in love with this person of Jesus, I had a great mentor who used to come in and teach me, and we'd read the scripture and talk. And after about a year of working with me, this is about 37 years ago, he said, "Tony, don't you think it's time you bring God into your workplace?" I said, "Yes, but I don't know how to do that." He said, "Let's pray about it." I said, "I don't want to wear God on my lapel here. I'd rather see a sermon than hear one." And then I was given an opportunity that forever changed my life. I, shortly thereafter, took a trip to Ethiopia. I had become the chairman of the subcommittee on international hunger in the Congress, and it was my job, I felt, to travel different places in the third world and look at different problems. And this was in 1984, and it was the time when Ethiopia had this major famine, and they had just lifted restrictions in traveling to Ethiopia, so I was like almost the first person to go to Ethiopia to see what was going on, and I was not prepared. I thought I knew something about hunger and famine and poverty. I was in the Peace Corps for a couple years, and I lived among poor people. I thought I knew something about it, but I really didn't know anything until I went to Ethiopia. And I traveled with Mother Teresa's group, Sisters of Charity. I was up country, and people were running for their life. There was civil war, and they had been running for about 100 miles, and it was this particular area was peaceful. It was on a plateau about 2 miles by light plane, at least for me, and there was about 10,000 people, and when I got there, they just laid down and started to moan. They were dying. And I walked between them, and I saw 25 children die. And they died of hunger-related diseases mostly. And I never got over that, seeing children die like that, seeing the mothers, how they understood that or how they took that, what that looked like. I had to wear my sunglasses because I had tears coming and I didn't want them to see it. And for the next 3 days, this is what I saw. And as I came home from that trip, I began to think to myself, you know, we do a lot of things in Congress that don't amount to much. And I thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to concentrate on hunger and poverty, humanitarian things. I'm going to spend my life doing this. And that's, excuse me, that's what I've been doing for the past, I would say, 35 years. So through Ethiopia, I was presented with an opportunity to bring my faith into my workplace. I was inspired to work through my position to help build the U.S. government's ability to provide aid and development assistance to what Jesus refers to as the least of these. I am of the conviction that a majority of people in need would prefer to see a sermon than hear one. And so we get to the question, how can and should faith guide and our aid and our development efforts? And have I found that to be, and should I let faith get into my job? And how does this fundamentally affect how you do this? This is even more pronounced when you work at a job that profoundly affects the poorest, most marginalized, and most vulnerable people in the world. There's over 2,500 verses in the scripture that deal with this issue of faith, but not only faith, but deal with the issue of poor, of poverty, of orphans and widows and sick and people in prison and the hunger. It's the second most talked about theme in the Bible. God is very clear. He doesn't say, I think it would be a good idea that maybe you think about the poor. No, he wants us involved. He wants us to really be involved. there's a couple verses in Proverbs that I really love, and they're in both the chapter 19 and chapter 16, and I'm paraphrasing, but God says, if you are gracious to the poor, you lend to me. He also says, if you help the poor, you honor me. I find that amazing. God doesn't say that any other place in the scriptures that I've seen, that if you help the poor and you are gracious to the poor, you honor me and you lend to me. I find that amazing that you can do that for God. So without getting too political, we also find ourselves in a time where putting our faith front and center in aid and development work is absolutely essential. And current conversations concerning U.S. commitments to foreign assistance seem to be increasingly geared towards what is essential for our country. And this can be troubling for those of us who see populations that may be left behind. Look at the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar, the continued suffering in eastern DRC, the everyday forgotten people of North Korea, whose pleas are drowned out by militant rhetoric and propaganda. I have been to North Korea 7 times. You wouldn't believe. I mean, I know all we read about is the nuclear situation. But you dare not put a body outside in North Korea, because in the morning, it's gone. There's cannibalism in North Korea. I've seen people eating grass and twigs. They put a little flour in it. They call it substitute food. You go to the hospitals, everybody's holding their stomach. The leader is draining the populace of all the money to put into his military programs. And so what do we do? At one point, the United States was in the year 2000 and before, 80% of the food going to North Korea was coming from the United States. This is interesting. There's a great proverb that says that if your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat, and if they are thirsty, give them water to drink, for you will heap coals of fire on their heads, and the Lord will reward you. I truly believe this is not only an instructive proverb, but also good foreign policy. We should feed our enemy. A lot of people disagree with me. There would be no stronger weapon against the regime than the weapon of love, grace, and mercy towards the very people it is trying to alienate from the world. The international aid and development communities need people of faith and conviction to keep our eyes on those people in the world who are suffering in the political and geographic shadows. We also need everyday people of faith in all walks of life to remember the least of these in the world. And we can do more than pray. We can fast, we can do advocacy, we can give, and we can do what Mother Teresa taught me. I met her a number of times, and she said to me one time when I was in Calcutta, I went with her downtown, and there was a man lying in the street, and it was in a very densely populated area of Calcutta. People were living on top of one another, living in the street. And I said something stupid to her, something like, I'm supposed to know something about hunger and homelessness and poverty. I mean, where does one start here? And she kind of ignored what I said and got somebody to pick up this man who was lying in the street. He looked dead to me. And she carried them home, got somebody to carry him home back to her hospice, and she began to wash him off. And she came back to me later on, after she hugged him and loved him and whispered in his ear, and she said, look, not everybody can come to Calcutta like you. I want you to go home and tell everybody, do the thing that's in front of you. And what she was saying was, if we all did the thing that's in front of us, probably we wouldn't need all this assistance in the world because we would take care of our problems. Do the thing that's in front of us. I thought that was a good word. Do the thing that's in front of us. What's in front of us? We don't have to go to Calcutta. Where do you live? In Fairfax, Arlington, Dayton, Ohio, my home? Do the thing that's in front of you. It's great to be with you. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.